Hey everyone, and welcome to the 47th week of the Free Assange Online Vigil. I am Andrew Smith. I am joined today with my two co-hosts, Steve Poikinen and Kendra Christian. I just want to say thank you to everybody tuning in. It has been 3,458 days since the illegal and arbitrary detention of Julian Assange began. 411 days since he was trafficked out of the Ecuadorian embassy into Belmarsh prison following a $4.2 billion international monetary loan fund to the nation of Ecuador. 104 days until the start of the second round of Julian Assange's extradition hearing. And it has been 1,088 days of incarceration for Reality Winner for releasing truthful information. And 74 days of freedom since Chelsea Manning was released from prison following the ending of the 10-year-long WikiLeaks grand jury. Tonight, we're going to have Sean O'Brien joining us in a little bit. But first, we did want to go over a couple really important stories that came out recently. One in particular is a CN Live article or a CN Live video that came out. But first, how are you guys doing?
Doing well, thanks, Andrew.
I'm splendid, and I just want to say that it is like hotter than a goat's asshole here in California right now. So if I start perspiring and like the shirt gets to look like it's, you know, a hypercolors from the early 90s, it's because it's really freaking hot out right now. If we could just jump right into this. Let me set it up actually. Because last night Consortium News Live had on Ray McGovern and Bill Benny. Which combined with Joe Lauria and Elizabeth Voss is like just Christmas on YouTube. And the first part of their conversation was centered around who is Guccifer 2.0. Sorry. So we should just jump into the video because it is Bill Benny's revelations are pretty damn incredible. So if we could cue that up and get that rolling, that would be swell. Okay, go ahead and yeah.
Bill, your take.
Well, yeah, I think Tim was just adding more fuel to the fire of the Russians didn't really do it. I mean, what we found, of course, was that when the testimony from the DNI was released by the DNI of Henry's testimony to the House Intelligence Committee, I mean, he clearly said that we had no evidence that the data was exfiltrated, and yet in public he was saying the Russians did it. Well, you know, from our point, just from the straight calculations we did, and we said in our article, the 24th of July in 2017, that the speed was just too great to go across the net, so it had to be a local download. And that was basically what CrowdStrike said. And then we had another whistleblower, I know hasn't been talked about too much publicly. He's talking about a program that was set up by Clapper and Brennan inside CIA, so nobody in the government would know it was running. And that was to spy on anybody they wanted to in the country. And that clearly was, in my view, the way the people who were involved in setting up Guccifer 2 most likely came from that group. And the reason I say that is because of the Russian fingerprints that were discovered by Tim and group over there in the UK that were in some of the emails that Guccifer 2 put out on the 15th of June that were published by WikiLeaks later as a part of the Podesta batch that did not have this fingerprints. Now that told me very clearly that's just more ammunition saying it's this group inside CIA, because that's the kind of thing that you would expect from a Marble framework type program that was compromised in Vault 7. And in Vault 7, they also said that that program was used once in 2016. So I think we're looking at that time it was used. So to me, it all points back at CIA as the origin of Guccifer 2.
I'm reminded of the
I want to I want to draw attention to a couple of things here. And the first thing is a little bit ancillary, but damn near every time I've seen Bill Binney on camera, he's wearing that shirt. So it must be like his lucky interview shirt. Um, I mean, it's weird. It's weird. It's a little weird. But that is what Bill Binney just said, that it looks to him, and forensically it looks to veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, that Guccifer 2.0 is in fact Clapper and Brennan, and that Guccifer 2.0 originated from inside the CIA, and that Vault 7 itself provides the link to this supposition. Really should have caused shockwaves all throughout independent media. It makes me I don't know, it makes me like question, why aren't more people in independent media tuning into Consortium News Live when they go on? Because this is a serious revelation that Bill Binney just made, and he is the, if not the, one of the foremost authorities on this type of subject. I was wondering if I could get some reactions from you guys on this.
Yeah, absolutely. When we went over the evidence, the actual warrant searching, and I think it was the chats between Roger Stone, Julian Assange, and WikiLeaks, where we saw that when Julian and or the WikiLeaks account was conversating with the Guccifer 2.0 account, it was literally like a joke. Like they were goading them on. They were saying, "Hey, send us this stuff. Oh no, sorry, we didn't get it. Send it again. Send it again. Send it again." And then even went as far, I think it was line like 48 or something like that, line 49, to call Guccifer 2.0 a Fed. Was like, hey, we just want to make sure that you're not, like up to some shady shit. You kind of sound like Fed. And like, so they WikiLeaks and Julian, in the situation that they were in, understood that this probably was someone trying to be nefarious that would later then frame them for any information that they put out.
Yeah, I did have one question. What is the DNI?
The Director of National Intelligence.
Okay, thank you.
Or the Directorate of National Intelligence, depending on if it's speaking as an office or as an individual.
Okay, and did
if
Bill
it's an
Binney
office, then it's ODNI usually.
Got it.
Yeah.
And did he say, I think I may have heard it incorrectly, but did he say that there were some of the Guccifer emails a part of that original Podesta release?
What he said is that there were two specific emails that came out that didn't have these fingerprints.
Right.
That Vault 7, it proves that U.S. intelligence can go into something after the fact and alter the fingerprints of it to make it look like it was coming from a specific place. And that on two different points in the Podesta emails, these fingerprints don't exist. So it's an oversight on the part of, according to Binney, the CIA, to not go back in and add those fingerprints in it. And he said that's what tipped him off to, or one of the things that tipped him off, put him over the fence on, yes, this is coming from CIA.
Wow. It's huge. I mean, you'd think it'd be all over the place, especially in independent media, especially in, right-wing independent media. You'd think a lot of people would be covering this. I don't know. I haven't seen anything. So I don't know if you guys have seen anything over there.
No, I still it's still hard for me to get people to acknowledge the fact that Sean Henry, the CrowdStrike CEO, was the handler for the FBI handler for Sabu, the member of LulzSec that flipped on the rest of the people that were a part of LulzSec and ended up bringing down a chunk of the anonymous collective in the process. But that's like even Aaron Mate, who reported on it, who was like, hey, look at what Sean Henry said. Sean Henry said there's no evidence of exfiltration of this data by the Russians. And as Ray McGovern calls it, the 35-cent word exfiltration, it just means it wasn't pulled out over an online connection or via hack. But in that testimony, like for Aaron to expose it and drop this bombshell, hey, look, pointing to these the transcripts of the Flynn investigation, where Sean Henry is out there saying, no, we don't really have any evidence of, Russia hacking into the DNC. We just feel like they did. So that's what we're going to report as gospel truth. There's another component to that, and that component is Sean Henry was Sabu's handler, and that CrowdStrike, the CEO of CrowdStrike, was his reward for being able to flip a member of LulzSec and try to bring down the entire hacktivist collective of Anonymous, which they didn't do.
Thankfully. But also, it's come out in tons of documents. I believe it was actually the Global Intelligence Files, the Stratfor leaks, that showed how intelligence communities were trying to inject information into WikiLeaks so that way they could destroy their accuracy rating and use that as a way to kind of drag them through the mud. So the whole persona of Guccifer 2.0 and the ensuing insanity of Russiagate, like the lie that followed, was really just a way to continue the further demonization of Assange while allowing these people to censor more and build more power and literally have the public want them to bring in more authoritarian control measures because they're afraid of the Russians.
Which has been always so interesting to me, because that whole argument is oftentimes said by the same side that's completely against the whole McCarthy era. So it's like, it's just always so odd to see those things, almost in the same sentence or by the same people without a blink in the eye. I don't know. I think it's I think what the country has been put through because of the Russiagate is a big deal, and I do hope that they. Do you guys know if are they going to be prosecuting some people, or I haven't heard on that?
So there's whispers and chatters about it. Ray McGovern actually wrote an article about it that we had talked about a few weeks ago, about how the key, like cabal players, essentially, like the Brennans, the Clappers, the Obamas, like those people in high-level cabinet positions, like basically literally broke the law with the FOIA requests and the way that they were trying to spy on the president and all of these other different applications that are illegal. And even though we have a massive security state here in the United States, what they did still was in violation of those laws.
I really think it's up to us to really push and call our representatives for some sort of accountability. I think that's part of why we've ended up where we are, is just never any accountability for these people who do these things.
Mm-hmm. It would be, if anyone was arrested for the hoax of Russiagate, it would literally be the first act of government accountability pretty much in my entire lifetime.
Yeah, well, there's no incentive for anyone in power to be accountable to us. Like it takes an overwhelming number of calls or emails or handwritten letters to any particular representative's office to get them to move on something, and it's not out of the scope of the American public to do it. It's just that it seems like there's only a handful of people that are willing to do that on any particular issue. It doesn't matter what the issue is. But there's no incentive for them to listen when they're the well-paid, well-compensated in other areas public relations firm for the American oligarchy.
Right, and you see them taking that same public relations and I mean, just using the opposite of it for people like Assange to smear him, because that's I know even on the street in Denver, that's some of the, sometimes we get that, oh, he's a Russian agent or he's, this and whatever, which would be, well, if he was a Russian agent, then he couldn't be a spy, for us, but, or a traitor.
The way that they're able to ingrain propaganda into people is crazy, because I was looking through articles today and it almost seems like the way that they do it is, even if someone doesn't believe it, there's just so much piled on there that people just like throw their hands up and have to just live within that bubble anyways.
Oh, I'm gonna. There's a question in the chat from Oz Whistles saying, "I need a flow chart to track the timeline on all this poo." Which email leaks are we talking about? In this specific case, we're talking about the Podesta emails and the Guccifer 2.0 persona that, according to Bill Binney, and this has been speculated by people who aren't Bill Binney, but to hear it from the basically like the smartest guy at the NSA turned whistleblower, to hear him say that Guccifer 2.0 is in fact a creation of Clapper and Brennan and was ran out of an office at Langley, as opposed to an office in the GRU or the FSB or whatever, is pretty monumental. So I hope that thank you, Rob Juno, for the super chat. And yeah, by the way, if there are any super chats on my show during a free Assange Vigil, I make a note of it. And then when YouTube pays me, which is at 60% of what the super chat is for, 3 months later, I will throw it all into the GoFundMe for the next round of the DC trip. In the case, Rob, by the way, where you've like super chatted to Reverend Annie and whatnot, like I'll do that out of my own pocket immediately and then recompensate myself after the fact. But yeah, that's how that works. And thank you again, Rob. You're freaking awesome, man. We love you and you're very generous, and I don't even know if we deserve that.
But to touch on it, in case the people aren't aware that are watching, we do have a GoFundMe going on right now, and I will drop the link, or one of us can, into the chat. But we're trying to raise money to get to the second round of the extradition hearings in DC. The hearings are in London. We're trying to host the protests here in the United States. If you can, please donate. This is going to be 3 weeks. We're working with tons of different organizations to try to get more and more actions built. Yeah, any dollar amount really helps. So,
And
it
if you
really
can,
does, and we totally understand if you can't donate, like that's fine. But the only thing that we ask of you is that you please share the link, because it really does make a difference. And we're going to do what we can to get on some other shows and add, like push this as well. But yeah, it really helps us when you share the link.
and one thing too is anybody who wants to join the Discord server, there's definitely always room for a lot of work went into last DC. We definitely learned a lot from that, so it'll be good because we can build off of that. But sometimes when you learn, then you realize like, oh, there's even more work to be done. So many helping hands would be appreciated too.
and I'm grabbing the Discord link to drop that in the chat too. But yeah, no, the Discord's probably the best and easiest way to get in contact with us too. If you're interested in starting your own local chapter, maybe you're not interested in coming to DC, but would like to do activism locally, we can assist you through the Discord there as well.
Yeah, ultimately what we would like is to not be the only people doing this, and certainly not having DC be the only US city that is throwing events and demonstrations during the second phase of the extradition hearing. We're coordinating with a number of other countries and number of other Assange groups, and we're hoping to have global simultaneous events taking place. So we would definitely like to see more of that here in the States. I know that the Bay Area Action for Assange Committee, those folks are going to try and put something together in San Francisco, and that will certainly be helpful. So we'll have East Coast and West Coast, but it would be nice if
Steve, don't forget about Denver.
I thought you guys were all coming to DC.
No, we have a whole group in Denver. So we'll be having flyers come out sometime soon for July 3rd, because that's Assange's birthday. So that'll be a big day of action too. And then we'll also do stuff in September as well. Definitely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we'll get to this in a little bit when we start promoting the upcoming international actions that are going to take place. But Alex Hills, our friend that runs Candles for Assange, she is very adamant that people throw a big old birthday party for Julian Assange on July 3rd, which will be his 49th birthday. And having spent a birthday locked up before, I can tell you how much it sucks. So, make sure that, you at least spend a couple of hours out in the street, do a banner drop, bring signs, whatever you can, get some public awareness going.
It's a good way, actually, leading up to Julian's birthday, to kind of build momentum within your community for him. We saw Ian Rose just reach out and talk to one city council person about World Press Freedom Day, and he managed to get them to put a motion before their city council and get it so that way Chelsea and Julie, well, I think it was just Julian specifically, were recognized. With Julian's birthday being July 3rd and July 4th being Independence Day in the United States, that gives us a big opportunity to kind of merge the two within the view of city council people. So coming up, we're probably going to start putting out little calls to action in our weekly call to action to try to get people to contact their city council about recognizing Julian's struggle on the 4th of July in recognition of him, but also it being the day after his birthday. And the 4th of July event actually was one of the first events that Taylor and I did together, was a Candles for Assange event out here where I'm from. We actually bought a birthday cake and got like pictures of WikiLeaks and Julian's face and a big old case of water because it was like 900 degrees, and just chopped up cake, gave people a piece, had a conversation, then gave them some water. And it was a really good way to, to build community engagement, I guess, and raise awareness around the issue.
The cake is a great idea, Andrew, because people love cake.
The water was actually better because people love cake until it's 90 degrees outside and they're like drenched with sweat. So the water got them there, and then the cake made them stay.
That's freaking yeah. We have about 5 minutes before we're going to be joined by Sean O'Brien. If anyone else in the chat has any questions, we'll go ahead and take those now. Otherwise, I think like one thing that I've noticed that's actually getting a little bit of traction here lately is the gray zone piece that Max Blumenthal put out, drawing a very straight line between President Lenin Moreno, Sheldon Adelson, and UC Global. There have been a number of interviews that Max has done. He's been on a bunch of podcasts. If you are unfamiliar with the story and you don't feel like searching back through, however many Action for Assange vigils that we've done where we've talked about this, then just go to the gray zone and within there search up UC Global or Sheldon Adelson. But this is something that you can take to your Trump supporting friends and be like, hey, what's going on? I thought he loved the WikiLeaks. Do you remember when your boy said, I love the WikiLeaks? We need more WikiLeaks. Come on, WikiLeaks. Let's have some more of this. It turns out that was performative. It turns out that was a festering pile of bullshit. And we know this because, number one, because of Cassandra Fairbanks. When we were in DC last time, we had the opportunity to hang out with Cassandra a little bit. We got an interview out of it. And she told us that Rick Grinnell, who is now the director, acting director of national intelligence, there's that DNI again, Kendra, that guy, he was appointed the ambassador to Germany. And as ambassador to Germany, he was the back channel between the Trump administration and Lenin Moreno, the puppet president of Ecuador, who, by the way, thanks to our friend Jose down in Ecuador, Jose said that Lenin Moreno transferred all of the responsibilities and power of the presidency to his freaking secretary and disappeared. His wife, the president of Ecuador's wife, was in New York last week. Nobody knows if she came back. It looks like the president of Ecuador is going ghost and is getting the hell out of his own country. So we're going to have Jose come on here soon and let us know a little bit more about this. But that crossed my vision a few days ago. I was just kind of blown away by it. I sidetracked myself. I don't even remember where I was when I started.
I was going to say, we have a question over in the A4A chat. It's coming from Gerald Kelly. Question: are we in contact with Julian's lawyers or anyone in contact with him? I guess the short answer would be if we tried. We've sent messages out. We've put requests out for different things from different people, bouncing ideas off of some of them. But we don't have any direct channel. Like the fact that it's been reported 3 court hearings in a row that Julian Assange is unwell, we haven't been able to get a confirmation as to why or to what degree from pretty much anyone at this point, to my knowledge.
No, I haven't seen anything either, Andrew, specifically as to what, how unwell he is. But then, just of note is, most certainly, tweets from Stella Morris and everything else, and Mrs. Assange, that we know of what's going on, that it's pretty bad. He's been pretty unwell for quite a while. So that situation only just wears on you further.
Well, and this is one of those things that Julian Assange accurately predicted about a decade ago. Like, they're going to come after you through me. They're going to chase me to the ends of the earth, and the punishment is the process by which all of this happens. And he couldn't have been more right, and that's incredibly unfortunate, because it's something where you want the guy to be wrong about something, like the one time that you're actively wishing for Julian Assange to get something very, very, very wrong is this exact thing. At this time, I would like to welcome back onto the Vigil one of our favorite people. He is a cybersecurity expert. I'm going to call you an expert, Sean. You're an expert. All right. And you are. Good Lord. I don't have the Rona. I don't. I smoke a lot, and that's why I cough. But Sean O'Brien has a nonprofit that he started recently called Privacy Safe, and I would love for him to talk about that as we go into the Vigil tonight. But without further delay, please welcome back to the Free Assange Vigil the one and only Mr. Sean O'Brien. How are you, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Heck yeah, man. We thoroughly enjoy it when you're on and everybody learns a ton, and we don't even feel like we were idiots beforehand for having not known it, which is rare, at least for me, when I talk to somebody who's experienced in the field that you're experienced in.
Cool. I appreciate that. It's always good to talk to you guys. And the whole thing about being an expert, I try to be too nice to be a normal expert. So I do my best. But yeah,
if you could smug it up a little bit, that'd be great. And we know that you're an expert. You just kind of talk down to us a little bit. Occasionally look over at me and be like,
got to work on it.
Once you appear in a hot dog, though, there's really no going back.
See, it's my own fault. Yeah, I'm a little beet red today, but no costume, unfortunately. So, got some sun though. Computer guys get them every once in a while. Get some rays. But yeah, so I'd love to talk about Privacy Safe. Privacysafe.tech, if you guys want to go out to that site. We're a nonprofit that is focusing on remote education, and also we're doing IoT devices, so little mini computers. We were working on these things in the past, trying to get cool things like Tor, the anonymity network, working on them. But now we're focusing on healthcare. So I just got off the phone today with Luis Falcone, who's the project leader at GNU Health. That's a hospital information system. We're going to be rolling that out on these little devices, specifically for things like testing, just basic personal health tracking. And hopefully that's going to coincide with the release of a mobile app as well. So the idea is get into people's hands the ability to keep track of your own health, not have to do it via one of these, surveillance systems that exist in most places. And the way things are, I mean, most people don't want to go to a hospital unless they really have to, and probably shouldn't, right? So in times of crisis, in rural areas, they just did a deployment of GNU Health in Tanzania. Very, very cool stuff for those kinds of environments. So that's what we're working on. And what I'd like you all to know, and the folks watching the stream, we're doing digital self-defense classes. So the type of stuff that I've talked about a little bit on this stream, Slow News Day, some other things. We're going to do live classes. You sign up for a membership for the nonprofit. You get, we're talking $2 a month, $5 a month, $8 a month. So just enough to kind of keep us going. And you get classes as they come through. So I'm on the schedule right now for digital self-defense. We're going to show you how to be more anonymous, more private, more secure online, more anonymous, hopefully completely anonymous. Working on that. But we're also going to, yeah, very cool stuff.
That's badass. I know I recently met some people who really could have used that. I'm going to tell a little story here, which is completely like just sidebar, but I think we'll tie in. About 10 days ago, 11 days ago, Vice News, which I don't normally check out too often, dropped an article that they had got documentation that grad students who were TAs at the University of California, Santa Cruz, had been targeted and surveilled using FBI and military grade surveillance tech, and they were doing a wildcat strike. The UAW, I believe it's 2685 is who the UC students are represented by, was not necessarily supporting them the way that they needed to be supported, so they struck out on their own. They shut down campus a couple of times. They were refusing to teach, refusing to grade, and as a result, Janet Napolitano, who is president of the UC system, also former Department of Homeland Security director under Barack Obama, which is a weird transition, I think, going from director of DHS to running a university system. But that's beside the point. She fired all 88 of the TAs who had participated in the strike. There was an unfair labor practice claim filed. About 40 of them got their jobs back, but a number of them had been suspended. The gentleman I spoke to, his name is Carlos Cruz, he's suspended for 2 years 2 years, PhD not candidate, but PhD student in the PhD program, and suspended for 2 years. And this is, entirely without pay. He was already had a part-time job where he was working 24 hours a week at a group home just to kind of supplement his income because UCSC wasn't paying them squat. But to find out that this level of surveillance was being deployed on people who were simply striking for a livable wage as opposed to a laughable one, is pretty concerning. And if it's happening at UCSC, like one of the more liberal or radical institutions on the planet, like Angela Davis taught here, she's still a professor emeritus. Huey Newton was getting his PhD at UCSC. Yeah, they tried to stitch him up on a murder charge, which it didn't work. But I mean, this is where Huey Newton decided to go to get his PhD. Like, it's not without its history in radical activism. But if they're doing it at UCSC, Sean, they've got to be doing it at Yale, at Harvard, at every other major institution in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up that story because it's a good jumping off point for a few things. The first one is it's not really that surprising, unfortunately, that someone who headed Homeland Security is now the head of a university system, right? We're starting to see that more and more, especially cyber warriors. So people in my quote unquote field, a lot of them are coming from the NSA, the CIA, and so on. And then they're leading a department, right? They're leading a business school or leading, some legal, which is really scary, or, a cybersecurity curriculum, right? So one of the things that I try to do and is good to know about the way that I try to teach, and the folks we're going to bring on as well, we're going to have some other people doing classes, haven't announced them yet, but they're going to be related, privacy, security, right? We're getting people who think about privacy and security from a real autonomy standpoint, right? We're not bringing in a lot of military jargon. We're not talking about this as if we're doing cyber war against the enemy, right? A lot of that stuff sort of, ends up getting in the mix. And we think about it in other contexts, which means the tools you use are different. We don't focus as much on things like threat modeling, right? Because it's one thing to say, hey, I'm snowed in, I'm on the run, I need to use this basket of tools to keep myself safe. It's another thing to say, hey, I need to stop using, Instagram because in 20 years, this is going to come back to bite me, right? So those kinds of things with privacy we're talking about, and I'm glad you bring that up. This example, another thing about it, I now know way too much to ever, sort of say to someone, hey, you're not being targeted, or, that isn't happening, right? It's difficult to know, right? There are times where I've second guessed, hey, this weird thing happened with my computer, or this weird, there's a van outside that's parked outside my house, and you don't know exactly what's going on. But the more we learn, the more we find out how routine this stuff is, right? And at elite universities, I mean, there's some of the places that are most surveilled, as you correctly point out. One of the things we learned from the Vault 7 disclosures, which were the 2017 leaks to WikiLeaks, right, was that certain platforms that are used by elites, especially elite students, iPhones, for example, which are very, very popular amongst, upper middle class, upper class, et cetera, and I mean, at Yale, it's all iPhones, right? It's almost all Macs, those were the target platforms, more so than the platforms that, the quote unquote average Joe would be having, right? So, yeah.
Now that, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that you'll find more expensive equipment at a more expensive university. But let's say we could go back in time like 3 months. What advice would you give to students who are getting ready to go on a wildcat strike? Like, how could they make themselves a little bit more anonymous, like not without giving away all of the the tricks of the trade that are involved with privacy safe, but just sort of a general thing. And there was a question in the chat too, like what does being anonymous matter if Gavin Newsom is unleashing 30,000 contact tracers in his little Gestapo snitch army?
Right. Okay, so if we're going to have organizing at all, we have to try to be more private, at least in certain contexts, right? obviously, when you're exercising your, you're using your political power, organizing, protesting, doing strikes, and so on, you're making yourself into a target to some extent. The best you can do in that situation is try to mitigate and not be a nihilist, not say, hey, screw it. Let's just openly organize on Facebook. All those things invite, infiltration, for example, and who knows what. Right. So what I usually recommend is actually first having a basket of tools that at least a small group of people, in a strike, the main organizers, the people who are really doing the planning, are willing to use and understand. So if you and I were going to do, an action, we meet over, let's say, a platform like this, right? Jitsi Meet, right? And we have a conversation about exactly what we're going to use. We're not going to go on Twitter and use maybe Twitter DMs, but we're going to use, Signal to talk to each other, or some other platform, right? And just making sure that everybody, as wide as you can cast that net, understands that these are the tools to use is really helpful. There have been a lot of cases, especially with student strikes, but also with labor strikes, where folks will post things to like a public Facebook page or something like that and give away information that, sure, it can be found out through surveillance, right? But why give it away? And as you know, part of the strength of Wildcat strikes is that you're doing it fast, you're doing it in an unexpected way, right? You're trying to bring together people from different industries, students with labor organizers, maybe, et cetera. So that kind of action, you have to be very careful about your tool set, right? Knowing the whys, why you're using that technology, knowing the hows, how to use that technology, and then identifying a few people in the group who can sort of be tech support is really helpful. So maybe you don't necessarily use the most private stuff in the world, right? But at least you know what tools you're using and you can use them and you can be quick about it and you're not going to screw up by, sending a text message, which creates a data trail that can be subpoenaed or something, right? If you start doing that, you're going to be a little better off. The other thing that I always say is if you can, cover your face. And that was harder to say, a couple months ago, right? Because you can make yourself a target for, oh, this person's trying to, do something nefarious. But now that we have, a pandemic and into the future, I think wearing at least partial face masks is going to be pretty normal. One of the things we know about this facial surveillance tech is that a lot of it's been overblown. So the companies now are starting to really scramble. There was a good piece that the ACM, which is a big computing group, put out where they were worried. They were like, oh my God, a multi-million-dollar industry might disappear because the cameras can't look around the masks and recognize faces, right? I say good. This is great.
Right. Thank God.
But that's a good sign for us, right? That means there really is some overblown marketing about the ability of these cameras, because there were a lot of companies up to that point, definitely, some of them I think were lying through their teeth, and some of them probably have reasonable, they can detect people. But if you can now, cover your face. And then, beyond that, the same stuff that we know from protests that works for, making sure you have a medical kit and things like that in case something goes down, somebody who's designated to be the person you go to if you need some medical care, right? We need to start thinking about technology that way. So
we had a question actually in the chat a little bit earlier, just before you hopped in,
yep.
That asked, what kind of movement will it take to get Julian out? And I think what you just described outside of a wildcat strike, but in general, is that movement that we need to build, where it's, and I'd like to kind of get your comment and opinion on this. In the opening to Cypherpunks, Julian defined the coming era of the internet as borders will be defined by the strength of encryption. And that's really something that we as activists take, at least me personally, very serious. So I was just wondering, maybe you could talk a little bit about what benefit encryption has, just briefly, because most of us know it already. But also, what kind of movement do you think it would take to get Julian out of prison?
Sure. So those words from Julian could not be more appropriate to the current moment. Surprise, surprise. He's always got, prescient and also future casting abilities. Um, but we're looking at a situation right now where most countries are cracking down with surveillance, both proximity tracking, right, ostensibly to, contain the spread of COVID-19. But this stuff will stick around, right? They're going to try to track people as much as possible via devices that surround us. So that's going on. But the second thing is by not allowing movements to use strong encryption technology that doesn't have so-called backdoors in them, right? This has been on the table for a very long time, really since the inception of strong encryption. There have been controls on that technology. Those controls went away, more or less in the late 90s, early 2000s, because basically a bunch of corporations needed to get exceedingly rich, right? And they wanted to send stuff over the internet privately. They needed to do private banking transactions. They needed to do private, credit card payments, PayPal's, all that kind of stuff. When you have that situation, you have, sort of an opening for movements to also use this technology, right? Because this same math, this same software, these same tools can be used for a different purpose. And I think that's what Julian was really, really getting at there. But, in the countries, especially the Five Eyes countries, right? The US, England, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. In those countries which have a data sharing agreement with each other, the idea is to break encryption, have backdoors in any strong encryption technology so you can do dragnet surveillance. The NSA, GCHQ in Britain, the CIA to a certain extent in the US as well, and all the counterparts in those other countries. And Homeland Security, I should also say, in the US is getting more and more access to this kind of tech. They are putting pressure on corporations in a very major way to break our ability to keep secrets, to have conversations privately, to send, anything privately over the internet, right? And the big bill I just want to mention in passing here, but it really is something we have to put a little more focus on, is Earn It, or Earn IT. That's a bill that has the potential of creating a infrastructure for backdoors in America, in the US. And companies that have strong encryption are either going to be able to, either they're not going to operate, right, in the US anymore, or they're going to be under extreme scrutiny and potentially get shut down like LavaBit did, right, an encrypted email service. Or, and that's a case where he said, the owner that said, listen, I either, shut down or give away all the secrets, and courageously decided not to shut down, right, or not to give away the secrets, right? But most companies, the Facebooks, right, the Microsofts, the Googles, et cetera, they're going to backdoor all the encryption. They're going to give the keys, so to speak, to government actors, probably to corporate actors as well, public-private partnerships, right? And
Facebook did this voluntarily like 2 or 3 years ago. They allowed backdoors to be built into not just Facebook DMs, but Instagram and WhatsApp. And at the time, there were a lot of people who were trying to organize on WhatsApp. And This was publicly available information that there was a backdoor built into it for surveillance and for Slack. Right. And yet activists, especially political activists, were trying to use these tools that like anybody with a badge can just waltz right into. For the viewers, because it's been a while since anybody has screamed about Earn It or Earn IT on the show. We've talked about it, and we've talked about it pretty extensively on Slow News Day. But could you just give kind of a summation of what Earn It does?
Sure. So there's already a certain amount of control over the ability for intermediaries or service providers to provide a service, right? Email, video chat, just a website with forums, or a social media site, Sean Book, or some version of social media, right? I still have to comply with certain laws in the United States. But there is something called Section 230 from the Communications Decency Act that removes a certain amount of liability from me for the speech of my users, right? So me having Sean Book, if you post something on there, okay, maybe if it's found to be illegal or something, I'm supposed to be reported, et cetera, but it's mostly an industry-wide moderation of those platforms. It's not the government coming and saying, hey, we're going to be the ones who are directly policing your platform. Give us the backdoor key to your platform, and we're going to sift through all the messages and say what can go up and what can't, right? So this thing called Section 230 is something that the Electronic Frontier Foundation, some other groups, very dearly want to fight for, and I also think needs to be fought for, to keep the internet free, to allow things like Wikipedia to exist, these big knowledge bases, but also, pretty much any service you can think of that you use on the web, right? And also over apps. However, big tech likes this as well, right? It's also the thing that has allowed Google and Twitter and Facebook, right, to be able to say, hey, we police our own platform. We don't allow the feds in, or when we do allow the feds in, it's under these conditions, right? Now, that's helpful at the moment, but it seems to be changing because EarnIt is going to require that anyone who is, covered by Section 230 has to follow a set of basic principles. Okay, and these principles, of course, are going to be decided by a bunch of people who are basically part of this cyber warrior, intelligence agency group. Bill Barr, who's the Attorney General, who is very anti-encryption, is taking the lead on this. The people who join the committee that's going to decide what those rules are is going to be more or less handpicked by him and some of his cronies, basically. And then they're going to basically say, hey, okay, you're allowed to have people on your platform. Sean, you're allowed to have Sean Book and have users on it, but you have to follow these specific rules. And guess what? You have to prove to us that you're following these rules, so you have to give us a backdoor. You can never have real end-to-end encrypted communication. Okay. The bill itself doesn't say encryption. I have to always point that out because there's people who say, oh, it doesn't say encryption. But there's no other way you can moderate services, right? You can't have real private conversations that are out of the purview of the service provider unless there is some way to surveil them. And that surveillance, would require the breaking of encryption, the breaking of these communications platforms to allow, the cops in, basically. So that's the gist of it. What could very well happen is we see all of the small providers, the small forums, the grassroots technology that we know and love disappear, and then the big tech companies will just decide to play ball, if this gets passed. So although, like I pointed out, the Googles and the Facebooks and so on have made a lot of, money and very powerful empires because they didn't have to have this burden of surveilling their platforms. Now that they are, kings of the mountaintop, so to speak, they can just turn around and create some sort of surveillance apparatus. And I'm sure they will find some way to do that if this is passed. So it could be a really awful problem, akin to what went on in Australia when the anti-encryption laws were passed there, and potentially akin to what's going on in the UK. There's some emergency laws that were passed under COVID that don't look like they're going to be lifted anytime soon. So,
yeah, and I'll let Kendra get to her question real quick, but at least in the case of the UK and Australia, and in part here, the company that's running all of those surveillance and tracking apps is our old friend Palantir.
Yep. Yeah. And there was a good interview with the gentleman who runs Palantir recently, which I'll try to track down, but you can look it up if you'd like to, where he talks very blatantly about how much work they do for surveillance, the surveillance apparatus, talks about the military work they do where they're literally controlling drones, or someone else is using their software to control drones that murder people, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very interesting to see the cognitive dissonance, right, in the conversation. On the one hand, he's trying to be transparent and show how, much of a humanitarian he is. And on the other hand, he's really revealing a pretty awful side of himself. So, and his company.
His own employees called him a monster. We found that out in the Stratfor global intelligence files. And he recently broke up with Donald Trump. It was amazing to me that as soon as Palantir got all these contracts from all these Five Eyes countries for Palantir software to run all of their own health apps and snitch apps, suddenly Peter Thiel didn't need to give Donald Trump his money anymore.
Right. And Peter Thiel, by the way, is also the person who has been investing quite a bit in this facial surveillance technology that I was talking about. Some of the worst firms are the ones that he's investing in as well. So you're going to see convergence of all these things. But yeah, onto the Julian thing, or back to the Julian sort of national borders, right? Where the encryption laws are, how they're controlled, how encryption is controlled and legislated and regulated is really going to define how much autonomy, privacy, and freedom, people have, and also where movements are allowed to sort of have uptick, right? So protecting encryption is really, really important to allow people to organize in the streets when we can do that again. So, yeah.
So one of my question was basically, and this will probably show my technological ignorance, but I think I am going to sign up for your classes, Sean. So say the Earn It Act does pass. I mean, is there any sort of, I don't know, type of technology that's on the horizon that, like an individual user would be able to use to sort of keep themselves anonymous? Or would that just be the end of that if you want to use any of these platforms?
Yeah, so I suspect if this does get passed, and we'll see, I expect we might have some modified version of it that goes through. I don't know if it'll go through in its current form because it's pretty vague and pretty totalitarian right now. And I do feel like there's going to be enough pushback from powerful entities that it'll get shaped a little differently. But, it's sort of that every time a new bill comes through, there's a little bit of pushback, but then it gets a little worse, right? And then it gets worse and worse, and we're on this sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, the problem is real power dynamics, right? If we are using technology that points to us as being different from everyone else, we're now the only ones who are protecting ourselves with a certain technology like Tor, like being anonymous on the network. We're standing out. And standing out from the crowd, of course, allows you to have all kinds of repression happen to you in other ways. So it is really, really problematic for movements in that way, unless you had a huge upswelling of people pushing and deciding to defy Earn It. I do think, unfortunately, the grassroots technologists, as I'm calling them, the hackers, whatever you want to call them, who decide to use this strong encryption are going to be potentially, they're going to be repressed in some way, potentially arrested, hunted down in some way, and penalized at the very least. So one of the ways, of course, because we don't have net neutrality anymore either, you can have your network throttled, you can be booted from the network. There are ways to control people that are a little more subtle and a little more, you just get fired for no reason or just not hired, right? So many folks out of work right now because of the opinions you express, et cetera. So I think those traditional levers of control are still going to be in play here. And unfortunately, yeah, if it gets passed, I'm very worried. I'd say we would be pretty screwed. Yeah.
So there's a way that Google actually already profits off of individual surveillance by government requests. Whenever the government wants some particular information from Google, they pay Google to give it to them. So it may be, and this is to your point earlier that you were making about not being weighed down by the burden of state surveillance, which is why most of them had resisted it, simply from like an economic standpoint. I think it would honestly be something that could make them money that they would use in that way and fashion. And I think that's what this big transition we're seeing in the economic world right now is a shift towards what people are referring to as surveillance capitalism, using essentially spy devices, your phone, the information about you, to better market, to put products directly in front of you. Um, but then it's also used for these nefarious purposes to profile and to attack political dissidents. So the infrastructure and maybe the lack of public outrage or awareness given all of these may actually create a situation where Google and the federal government can slip some bullshit through like this, that they would make billions on the back end, and on the front end just give everything over to the US government that they already have it.
So that's quite terrifying. And I've heard a little bit about this. I'm not sure how much that scales, but they could make it scale, right? And we could see a very drastic shift pretty quickly. If that sort of thing starts to happen, right? If EarnIt passed and it were also filling the coffers of the private surveillance capitalists out there, it's very akin to the type of surveillance and the private-public partnership we see in China, right? And just to, because I didn't quite answer the previous question, perfectly, but just on this point, let's say something like that happens, right? Well, then the United States is going to be looked at a place just like China is now, where, people in the United States basically, quote, need help from the outside to be free on the internet. And I do think there is the possibility that at that point, we're going to have to create international, coalitions in a much stronger way than we have. If we're going to have folks who are in the US, I might have to dial into a VPN in Switzerland before I do anything, right? If I am allowed to do so, or maybe I go through my buddy Bob, who's willing to take on that liability, right? And then it goes to Switzerland, and these types of coalitions and so on can be figured out. But the unfortunate part is the knowledge becomes more and more arcane, more difficult. Access to just the information, let alone the actual technology, becomes something only elites or people who have some sort of economic mobility are able to even figure out, right? So it's a very scary prospect. If that transition happens, yeah, I don't know what to say about the US. We're going to be in serious trouble. You might also see, though, some pushback, I guess, from other actors who are powerful in IT, in other parts of the industry. I don't know how much, for example, folks who are working in IT running networks really can profit off of this. I know Google can, right? But can the, network admin who's running, some huge LAN in California for millions of users, right? In the state system or for, some university or public school system or something like that. They're not going to profit. And it's going to be an enormous burden on them to have to do that surveillance for the government. So yeah, I don't know. There could be some pushback, but big tech is very powerful and their reach should never be underestimated. So
I'm sitting here kind of stunned because these are the exact same conversations that we had during the lead up to SOPA.
Yep.
All those years ago. This is the exact same kind of feel that SOPA brought, that Earn IT, whatever you want to, however you want to say it. It's the same sort of general, but I don't know, same sort of general fight, I guess, is the most simplistic way to put it. And SOPA would have gone through if it weren't for big tech companies stepping up and participating in the day without an internet. Do you feel, Sean, that, I mean, Google aside, are there enough big players to go ahead that would participate in another day without an internet style event? Like, is that something that as activists we should be kind of thinking about trying to organize along with what we're currently doing inside Action for Assange?
Sure. So first, I want to mention, if we are thinking about that and thinking about that as being a viable, way to call attention to this, which I think it very much is, blackouts on websites across the web, right? Then the group we really want to look at and we really want to support is Fight for the Future. They were very instrumental in doing that and doing some other pretty big events. Evan Greer, who is over there, who we had a conversation with a couple weeks ago about activism and COVID and so on, is the type of activist you want in that fight. But I do agree with you that if we did not have those big, powerful corporations step in, it still would have been, I mean, it was very nail biting there. And I think we have a generational shift, unfortunately. So one of the things that's gone on is folks who have grown up now in the generation after mine, right? Whatever we want to call them, Gen Z or whatever. I hope they don't call them Zoomers, or if Zoomers, I don't know what's what. Maybe that's the generation born now. But anyway, whatever we call that generation, those folks have grown up with smartphones, right? And they've grown up with walled gardens. So apps that ostensibly give you chunks of the internet, but are controlled by one company, gives you sort of a siloed understanding of how networks work, don't give you the kind of community feeling or, you know, understanding of free speech and really tech liberty that I think a lot of millennials had. Which is why I think, you know, these previous bills, SOPA, and then all the other things, PIPA and the variants, were able to be stopped. If we are unable to get, you know, the people using TikTok and the people using all these other apps to also care about this, right, to care about Earn It, then I think we are a little dead in the water, because it could very well be that most network activity is happening on those platforms and not the spaces that we consider the traditional internet. You know, we live in an environment where most traffic that's going through the pipe in the United States, at least, is actually just video streaming. And we don't traditionally think of that as an internet service, but, you know, if you were to roll it back 10, 15 years ago, that was not what people were doing on the internet, right? Passive entertainment. There was a lot more active community building, information sharing, and a lot of that information sharing, sure, it was entertainment, right? We piracy and everything else through BitTorrent, but you know, that's also a good way for people to get exposed to communities, exposed to the idea of free information. Wants to be free, right? Actually being able to share something with someone that's interesting or whatever, gives you a chuckle. And that sort of thing is just happening in these, you know, in a TikTok, right? In these other platforms, in Facebook, in whatever it is. And, you know, it's going to be a hard conversation to have with that generation. And I'm not trying to put everything on their shoulders, but we know movements like this are only successful if we can get the youth mobilized, right? So I think we're going to have to think more about that. When I teach, I have a lot of people who have grown up with a smartphone, and many of them may use the smartphone a lot more than their laptop, right?
Yeah.
And there's certainly plenty of people who are not in school who are only using phones, right, and not using laptops at all. And if we can't bridge the gap there, right, and get those folks involved in internet activism, then yeah, we're in quite a bit of trouble. But we need to start moving. And now that I'm even talking about it, I'm getting a sense of urgency, and my palms are sweating. It's easy during COVID to sort of put these things aside, but yeah, Earn It is a big deal. And by the way, I think they are trying to be cute, saying you got to earn it to you know, whatever. So
yeah, because they're like an arbitrary set of good behavior standards that you're supposed to follow. And again, like, I can't stress this enough. The Earn It Act is being marketed as something that is to protect the children. And
of course.
And that should just raise a forest of red flags for anyone who's spent like any time with their eyes halfway open. Is that when a bunch of, you know, when a bunch of millionaires and billionaires, not to borrow a line from Bernie Sanders, but you know, it's factually accurate, when people in real when people in positions of real or perceived power are standing in front of you and telling you we have to do this for the children, that usually means we're about to slap on a sandpaper condom and fuck you.
So I'm a big George Carlin fan, and late in his comedic career, I mean, he basically was doing these political monologues, which were great. And one of the things he points out is, besides patriotism, it's always that for the children stuff. That is how we get repression. Now, child exploitation is a problem. It's bad. Sex trafficking is a problem. It's bad. But to use these things as a bludgeon to curtail freedom of information, but also autonomy, like being able to move through the world without being spied on, is, pretty despicable. It also makes it hard to have the conversation, right? Now you've got people who are real victims who have had, all kinds of issues with, whatever, cyberbullying, stalking, all kinds of stuff on the internet, atrocious stuff go on. And, they don't necessarily want to hear from a guy like me coming in saying, hey, I know all that stuff is a problem, but it makes it more difficult to have the conversation. And of course, politicians are aware of that. It's easy to make it look like someone who cares about these broader issues as being sort of an idealist or utopian or whatever. But in the real world, we've got child porn, right? That's sort of the way they set up the dichotomy. And it just sort of stifles the ability to even have a debate, unfortunately.
Apparently, all you have to do if you want to look at kitty porn is go to Paul Krugman's hard drive.
Well, and here's the other thing. So, and we could get into the whole dark web thing, right? But some of the biggest child porn, sites on the dark web have been the ones used in so-called sting operations, right?
Yeah.
The FBI will take a network of computers, set up some, and maybe they'll catch a couple people, but often there's some kind of corruption involved where the cases don't go right, et cetera, et cetera. Very recently, I want to point to not a child porn situation, but a sex trafficking sting that the FBI was doing in Mexico. And they had to throw out all of the cases that they were making against these alleged sex traffickers, pimps and people running massage parlors, etc., where sex acts were happening. They had to throw out all these cases because the FBI themselves, right, were going into these massage parlors, right, were taking advantage of these victims. So you have a lot of corruption there. And there's no reason to believe that, of course, you and I shouldn't be able to send an encrypted email to each other, right? Because something nefarious is done by someone else. It's just an absurdity on the face of it. I do want to get back to the point before I forget, going back again to sort of this big picture stuff Julian was talking about being able to have more power in movements if you have encryption, or at least, more autonomy, more freedom in the places that have, the ability to use these tools. We saw a lot of hacktivist or so-called hacktivist energy, again, 10, 15 years ago, right? And a lot of that around what was being called anonymous, people wearing masks, getting in the street. We know there's been some, solidarity there with Julian and WikiLeaks and all kinds of other movements. I do expect we're going to see something like that come out of what's going on with the pandemic. We're going to have a lot of people who see the world a lot more malleable, than they thought it was. And they're going to have their eyes open to a lot of things, a lot of information, like conversations like this, that will really, I think, change the way that they look at the world. The same old questions of organizing are going to apply, right? As movements grow and you build these networks and you sort of have coalitions, it's harder and harder to keep these movements going without having clashes, political differences and so on. But I do think that, part of that autonomy and that ability to organize is going to be knowing how to control the smartphones in our pocket, right? Knowing how to create alternative media and use alternative platforms while we still can. And if that means, hey, it's all going to move overseas out of the United States, then it does. That's a challenge for me in the US and some of the other people. to try to affect change here. But if we're unable to hold these, tide gates back, we're going to have to look elsewhere. The problem being the U.S. empire is extremely, has a long reach, to put it mildly. So when the U.S. goes down, so to speak, it is going to have a lot of fallout worldwide. If we see things like mandated backdoors in technology. Yeah.
I mean, at that point, is the entire veneer of this idea of liberty just gone? Is it more or less like that's the beacon that says we live under pure totalitarianism, regardless of the propaganda we see around us?
Yeah, I mean, it depends which side of the bed I get up on in the morning. How much I think things are doing well or doing poorly in that regard. How far we're creeping towards totalitarian or not. The long-term curve has obviously gotten worse. I tried to think of a single, win for privacy that was a long-term win. And the other day, trying to think, hey, has there ever been a case where surveillance was fought back and it was fought back, quote unquote, permanently? And I can't think of one. It does seem that on the long-term curve, we are getting to a point where, what we consider civil liberties are being curtailed. And we're seeing some of the science fiction stuff drastically accelerated, especially when we have a big event like COVID-19, right? So the first thing I said was, look, we're going to see drones now become a bigger thing than they ever were. We're going to see things like, Google Glass come back. Now, we didn't get Google Glass, but we're getting Apple Glass, right? These technologies that have sort of failed, that have a very strong surveillance element, I think are going to be tried again in crisis environments like the crisis we're in. And let's say we fight those back for a little while, right? Fight back for, 5 years or something. Then we're going to see real effects of climate change, right? We're going to see real crisis again. Can we stop, this sort of surveillance creep, this totalitarianism, when we have crisis after crisis after crisis? I don't know. I know that the only thing I can do is fight, and keep trying to, especially, fight being a little dramatic, but I can at least impart information to help as many people as I can. We can still have these conversations, at least right now, and we should keep doing that. The other thing I just want to point out too is we have an entire class of IT professionals right now who is more or less out of work. We're going to see entire industries that were attached to the tech unicorn bubble that we had, which the peak might have been in 2019, depending on your perspective. We're seeing all that crashing down, and we are going to have a lot of folks who have the skill set that can help out movements or even generate new movements or new technology, et cetera, maybe even more humane technology, more privacy respecting technology. Those folks are going to be out of work soon if they're not out of work already. And can that energy be directed in a positive direction? Maybe. I do think we're starting to see tech unions and things like that. And these folks who got into the business of IT because they thought it was a sure thing and a steady job and the kind of thing that gives you a 401k and you retire, in 30 years or whatever safely. Those folks now are suddenly, kicked out of these companies, or the company disappeared, or the investment dried up, et cetera. And you can't live in San Francisco if you're not making huge six-figure salaries, large six-figure salaries, right? A lot of these folks, or Menlo Park, or Mountain View, or whatever. Where those people are going to go?
Real quick,
Yeah.
The San Francisco Chronicle in 2018 listed people making $147,000 on a family of four as low income for the Bay Area.
The expenses are just through the roof, right?
But yeah, I'm right down the road. So I know how much it costs me with 3 kids a month to live in Santa Cruz County, and it's fucking ridiculous.
Right. So what's going to happen when you have all these skilled workers who now aren't working for these companies that, change their entire lives around living on some tech campus or something, and now they're more or less on the street? I don't know, but that's a destabilizing force that could lead to some positive change. I'm not trying to look to some sort of tech vanguard to save us, but I do think we need to think about bringing some of those folks into some of these concepts we're talking about. Real grassroots movements, real grassroots technology, trying to remove some of the borders between what we call the digital world and what we call the physical world, because in reality, there isn't much of a distinction these days, and maybe never really was, right? So
Yeah. Well, and look, man, if we're going to be ruled by soulless technocrats, it's going to take tech savvy people with a soul that have the skill set and the tools to be able to help us fight that battle. Like we can't, especially like I'm pretty tech dumb. And for me to be like I can organize, I can get people in one location, I can, bring people to the streets, but I can't myself wage a battle against technocrats because I don't personally have that skill set. So we're going to need that. And I do think the conditions are right for it. We basically had armchair activists now for almost a decade.
right.
Occupy really well, no, I guess SOPA and that was 2012 or 14.
2012. I think it was 2012.
2012, yeah.
If I recall.
Yeah, so it's been, I mean, it's been at least 8 years since we've had like real asses in the streets over something. And I think the conditions are just about perfect for it now. And I don't predict often, like as a rule, really. Like I'm not a gambler, none of that, but if I had to make a prediction, I would predict a reemergence of something like Anonymous. I do. I have a sense that the people who were part of the original collective have had enough.
Yeah.
And everything that has been hurled at us during COVID has been, you couldn't paint a clearer picture of this is a totalitarian takeover. They're making it painfully obvious that this has nothing to do with your health and everything to do with control. So the people who are, in their late 20s, early 30s, who are finding themselves with a skill set in tech and out of work, are primed to be a part of a new anonymous style resistance effort.
And I also
What
think
is the best way to reach people like that too? Just to add that at the end.
yeah. I don't know. Everybody likes playing with toys, right? So if you can, especially folks who are bright and inventive and, and really interested in creating. So I think being able to come up with creative ways that we can utilize technology, not necessarily to break things, but potentially to do things like, I don't know, send out ultrasonic signals to block smart speakers that are spying on people, stuff like that. Those kinds of projects are the types of things that have a social dimension, that also, somebody who's not necessarily an activist, but into tech might be interested in. The other thing we have to do is we have to train people who have come from backgrounds that have dealt with real shit in their life, pardon my English, and have those people be techies, train them up, having everybody who's middle class, upper middle class, from these backgrounds, being the tech vanguard, white male bearded guys like myself, is not ideal, to put it mildly. We need to have people from all kinds of different backgrounds and train those folks up, but train them in such a way where they're also allowed to feel I don't know, it sounds corny, but that they can tell their story, so to speak. Somebody who has come from a background of poverty, when they get into technology, they're much more likely to think about that dimension when they're implementing, creating new technology, right? And maybe the technology they create will be something that can empower people, right? Rather than make more people, under someone's boot. I don't have any real answers for getting mass movements going, but I do my little part. We can all do our little part, and we've got to keep free flow of information. So free software, free culture, sharing as much as possible. It's going to get very tempting to lock down information, as we all need to keep making a paycheck, right? So for example, the classes I was talking about, we're going to release those videos under Creative Commons license. Now, I understand that removes some of the appeal of paying for a class, right? But we're hoping the value add will be being able to talk to the instructor, having a real community conversation, and those kinds of things will be what people want to pay for, which are positive in and of themselves, right? But the content, right, we don't necessarily want to lock that up. So the other thing we're going to see is the information system get very centralized. Around, a handful of streaming services, see more walled gardens, trying out new business models, might see some resurgence of some blockchain conversations about getting monies that way. And we want creators and people who are who have independent voices and can remain independent. We want them to be able to do that, right, by making a living, but we've got to make sure the flow of information doesn't get stopped. If I ran over to Spotify with whatever content I had and I locked it behind a subscription, that isn't ideal for me being able to reach as many people as possible. And you never know what kind of spark you're going to light under somebody's ass, so to speak. So.
I was keeping it up. I wanted to see if someone else wanted to hop in. Steve was muted. But
Yeah, I
no,
was trying to listen to our tech guy who told me to put the A4A email address in my chat, but I have to stop doing that. So
um, but so we had a question come from the chat, and I know we've touched on this before, but it's kind of been a while. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like search engines and different ones like that are out there for the different, I don't know, like tiers of techie, I guess.
Sure. So search engines are notoriously difficult to do. Just to give a little bit of history here, for folks that remember Yahoo and Alta Vista and so on, it was always a cat and mouse chase, right, for the results in a search engine to be good. There were constantly folks who were finding ways to game the system. In fact, they're incentivized to do so when they're making money off what were then banner ads and basic ad revenue, right? Then Google hit the scene and they decided to have quote unquote inobtrusive, ethical, do no evil ads, right? And they have their famous text ads that they have and their customized results in their search engine. That introduced a certain level of surveillance. When you are customizing results, you have to build profiles on people to customize those results. And then those profiles in and of themselves become valuable. Now, they were ultra auctioned off basically by investors and so on, to the point where Google blew up into this huge thing. But I think most of us can agree that having some sort of data profiles on people has a value. It would be nice if they were purged and, you customize the results 1 or 2 times or some other scheme, and so that you could give somebody the ability to, have nice custom results without spying on them. But we don't live in a world that incentivizes that kind of activity. So at any rate, search engines have become, one of the major places that not only targeted advertising and what we might call surveillance capitalism has arisen, right? But they've also become one of the most centralized services on the internet. I can't spin up my own search engine and think I'm going to compete with Google. It takes a massive amount of power. access to information and business deals and processing power. We're talking real, access to hardware and server racks and things like that to even attempt to have a search engine, right? That all said, there are a few alternatives that are a little better, and some I would say are a lot better. The one that I like personally, that I think gives you the best trade-off between functionality and privacy, is DuckDuckGo. Now that is based in the United States, so you have to take that into account to a certain extent, that the service is US based. But one of the nice things about DuckDuckGo is you can actually use their search engine as a proxy, an in-between for other services. So if I want to search Google, I can use DuckDuckGo to do it by typing in cats, right? And then putting !G, right? And then that will actually search Google, but do it through DuckDuckGo's servers. So now Google, for that first hit, doesn't know that it was me searching it, right? They think it was DuckDuckGo's machine somewhere, right? Instead. So that's helpful to avoid what we call the filter bubble, this customization that we were talking about with search engines. There's also a start page over in Europe. That's more or less a European kind of DuckDuckGo, a little less functionality, but same dedication to privacy, it seems. And if you believe in a lot of the data protection and so on, that's a good control on data. Jury's still out, in my opinion, but if you believe it is, then maybe you want to use a European search engine. So that's a good choice. There's Quant, QWANT, which is also European. They seem to be okay. There's
What about
Disconnect.
Brave?
Okay, so Brave, to my understanding, is using DuckDuckGo.
Okay.
Yeah, for
No, I recently had somebody suggest it to me, and I
Yeah,
like
so
to check with you before I make a tech decision. You were Sleepy Josh. Like like that's
yeah, there you go.
ask the mechanic if I'm about to tear into my car.
And that's exactly that. But listen, I'm always learning too. So but that's exactly what we're talking about, where we have to have conversations, and I hear that less and less, by the way. I hear more people arguing over technology rather than saying, hey, what do you recommend? And then trying to take that information back and trying it out. We need to have more of these convos, which is important. Brave is basically a fork of Chrome browser, which is Google controlled more or less, because the core of Chrome is something called Chromium, which is free and open source software. Brave can take that, yank out the terrible Google bits, and put their own stuff in there. I like Brave. It has an ad blocker built in. It has a few other cool features that are great, that stop tracking on the web, force SSL connections, which creates encrypted connections between you and the website, right? And also it has something called a basic attention token, which is a sort of a blockchain incentivizing thing. I'm not really huge on that, but if that's your thing, try it out. The idea is basically you can get paid for looking at ads, or at least get something for looking at ads. So maybe that's a revenue model that can replace Google. I'm skeptical, but some folks are working on that. Now, there's two other search engines I should mention. One's Disconnect. Disconnect is similar to DuckDuckGo in a sense, only it actually only spiders Google content. So you can use Disconnect to search Google more privately. And then there's something called Search, but it has an X at the end. So SEARX. That's actually interesting from a technical standpoint because it's actually decentralized. Meaning there is no centralized server that's running the entire show. And if we want to have search engines in the future that are truly privacy respecting, that truly can't be infiltrated by, some three-letter agency, we need to have that. Can we get there? It's going to take a lot of people helping out, but it is a hard problem. Search engines are not the easiest thing to get right. Google, which I mentioned, has relied upon a lot of free services. They won't talk about this, but there's been plenty of academic work done about it. But so, for example, Wikipedia is heavily weighted in a Google search, Well, if Wikipedia didn't exist, right, they wouldn't be able to lean on that to make their results more relevant, right? When I look up cat or mountain or whatever, especially when I'm looking up real, information, I'm trying to learn something. So we do have to remind ourselves that a lot of times these big tech surveillance companies, when they're giving value adds, so to speak, to us through customized results, let's say, they are still standing on the backs of volunteers and nonprofits often. The example that I used of them using open source software, right? This stuff is written by volunteers around the world, does have corporations working on it as well. And people who are working at corporations and people who are telling their boss they're doing one thing and then actually working on what they care about, right? So there's a whole mix of people who work on these open source projects. But the bottom line is a company like Google, a company like Facebook, a company like Apple, they couldn't exist without being on the backs of these other projects. And we have to remind ourselves of that, because if they didn't exist, we could create the world we want without them. They are a barrier, a hindrance to real sustainable tech ecosystems. They are not the people who have drug us out of our Paleolithic understanding of the world, as these enlightened, technocrats, showing us how things should be. So it's important to fight that conception of the world.
I have one question for you, Sean. You had mentioned that, if things maybe go a certain way in the US, that you would, have to look internationally. Where internationally were you thinking? I mean, I'm just interested to hear of countries that you may know of that are, that do support this encryption and things like this.
Sure. So traditionally, Central Europe and Scandinavian countries have a strong, I'd say, internet activism culture. Now, that does not mean they are necessarily free, so to speak. We know, for example, how totalitarian places like Sweden can be, and so on. But, you have groups like the Chaos Communication Congress in Germany. You have some really good hacker groups and hacker collectives there. Switzerland tends to be the place that folks look when they want to have a real secure, encrypted, private service. As we've learned, though, they are not beyond being infiltrated, right? There have been famous cases recently going way back where basically they were breaking encryption in old typewriter-style encryption machines. And when those companies became digital companies, they still had NSA folks calling the shots, right? So Switzerland is not necessarily immune either, but generally speaking, those countries, right, somewhere in the EU or maybe Switzerland are the places that folks tend to look. The U.S. is powerful. We saw from the Snowden disclosures. We've seen from a lot of the WikiLeaks stuff. I keep bringing up Vault 7, but it's definitely relevant here. A lot of the technology that Vault 7 we learned about through Vault 7 was actually being operated and deployed from a military base in Germany, unbeknownst to the Germans, right? So it's not as if these are necessarily safe havens, but generally speaking, if you can get a service in one of these countries that at least has a legal framework that is not designed to screw you over and allow warrantless search and seizure, at least there's some barrier there, especially if you're not under the full, you're not fighting the full might of the US government. It's a good thing to have your emails in Switzerland or a place like that. Yeah, I'd say.
Mine are.
So, looking into the future, what do you think some milestones would be to show, I don't know, that we've built something more permanent? Because you were talking earlier about, yes, we have victories, but none of them seem of great permanence. So, what would be some of those big tells that would show that?
Sure. So if we can get start with the basics and get actual messaging right, So if we were able to have end-to-end encrypted messaging that also has decentralized, or what some people call nomadic identities, right? That you can move from service to service or server to server and so on. If we could get that to be popular and used by a lot of people, I would consider that a big victory, and one that's really hard to roll back, right? Signal is great, right? Some of these other services are great. I recommend them, but I'm really thinking more about a service like matrix.org, right? Where you can run an encrypted server on your own hardware, out of your own home. And now you can tangibly pick up that device and toss it in the trash if you want to, or you can move your identity from your friend's server, from your server to your friend's server, or to a server halfway across the world. I think if we could have that be popular, because you can do it now, you just need to know a lot about technology. If you can get that to be something that is used by a 9-year-old kid, that would be the kind of technology that I think, or the kind of win that. And by the way, also a 90-year-old person, then I think we've won something. We have to start thinking about tech as not necessarily a shell game for investors to put massive amounts of capital and then shift it around. There is no reason that we can't have a lot of these services operated on a lot of the infrastructure we have now. We basically have supercomputers, in our homes that are massively more powerful than the things we were using, 10, 15, 20 years ago, that can do all kinds of interesting things. But they sure as hell can send a text message, right? They sure as hell can send an email, right? There's no reason we can't have these kinds of things be infrastructure for a freer world, so to speak. And one of the wins would be thinking about technology in that way. How do we take the good old Web 1.0 protocols, which people may not even be, focusing on right now, and make those viable in a real freedom respecting, private and secure way? And if you can do those kinds of things and actually get people using those services, it really takes a lot of the money out of the tech bubble, and then it takes a lot of the incentive out of the at least generating new types of surveillance. If we can make it unprofitable, if we can make it hurt more in their wallets, not just in the way that a guy like Snowden talks about, where encryption makes it more expensive to surveil somebody, right? We know that's true, but we also need to just remove the money from some of these industries completely. There should be no sub-industry around email surveillance or email marketing surveillance disguised as email marketing. We need to sort of remove the money from these things. And now might be the time to do it, when things are a little topsy-turvy, to put it mildly. So yeah, I don't know. Bans on facial surveillance are another big one. And that's one we're going to have to fight. And the conversation is going to be that much harder now, because these facial surveillance firms are starting to get into the hygienic technology game, where they're trying to posit themselves as an alternative way to safely check somebody out at the grocery store or whatever it is. We need to throw this stuff in the trash. It just needs to go. Again, to bring back the example of Google Glass, right? That used to be my example of, okay, there's no such thing as surveillance determinism, right? A technology can come up and it can be rejected by populace and get thrown in the bin, right? But here we are again, unfortunately, in this time of crisis, we're going to see something like Google Glass come through Apple this time. Can we reject it and throw it in the trash again? I don't know. I don't think necessarily the main reason people were rejecting it was because they were afraid of surveillance, but they did at least understand it as being creepy. So can we get there? I don't know. So yeah, I guess I'll just take my two, which would be better decentralized services, actually stuff that grandma's using, right? And if we can get rid of the more atrocious edge stuff, the drones that spy on us, the facial surveillance, the stuff that I don't think people are, they're still calling creepy. They haven't internalized and normalized yet. If we can stop that, I think those would be wins. So.
Hell yeah. I don't know how much time you have, Sean. So if you need to just let us know.
Okay.
You've been on for oh wow, it's been like an hour and 45.
Don't mind
It
chatting.
doesn't feel like it. It really doesn't, man. I love it when you're on the show. Because we get to talk about this stuff and have it have it explained to us by someone who doesn't treat us like we're blithering idiots. Although I'm pretty sure Andrew understands it way the fuck better than I do. I don't know, man.
You guys are all smart and you know it. But you know what? Most of the smartest people I've met are just in casual conversation, right? And I do think, look, I attribute the knowledge that I have very much to listening and having these kinds of conversations. So I'm happy that I have a platform and can be, the expert in the room.
Oh, absolutely.
It's
I
very
did,
nice.
just to kind of circle back here towards the end of the program, because we'll probably be wrapping up close to 11 as is. Do you want to give some thoughts on Julian's situation with everything that's happened recently?
Yeah, so I haven't been paying as much attention as I should. So do you want to give me a summary?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So this goes back probably about 2 or 3 months now. Julian had his bail denied amid the COVID-19 pandemic.
That I know. Yeah.
They've had multiple prisoners die there. Official numbers are 2. Unofficial numbers are way more than 2, and that the prison's in chaos. Those are paraphrasing, but more or less Julian's words. His court trial has been postponed until September. I believe it's September 7th is the kickoff date. And at least for the foreseeable future during this COVID-19 pandemic, he's going to be kept in 23.5 hour a day isolation with almost no ability to contact anyone, including his legal team.
So that I all knew. I thought maybe something happened like today or like,
Oh, no.
No, there's a case management hearing on the 1st of June.
Okay. Cool.
And I'm not really sure. I mean, they basically every 30 days or 28 days, he has to present himself to the court, although he hasn't been able to do that through video link for the last 3. We're talking about a situation here where this is inarguably the biggest press freedom trial of the last 50 or 60 years, without a doubt. And the person who is being tried has no way to communicate with his legal team. He was for the first 6 or 7 months that he was in Belmarsh, he wasn't even allowed to access the documents that were going from the court proceedings. Like, no way to help himself prepare for his defense. And just as we started seeing a lot of movement from the professional class, for doctors for Assange, barristers for Assange, an international organization, entire Council of Europe released a statement where it was a unanimous statement in support of Julian Assange. And then boom, COVID hits, free assembly is canceled. The ability for people to meet was switched over to video format, and most people went to Zoom just because it was convenient. And Zoom, as we all know, is garbage, hot, steaming garbage. Which is why I think that Jitsi is a much superior way to meet. There's a platform in the UK called 8x8, which is almost identical. Yeah. But as far as like earth-shattering updates, the most recent one that came out through the Gray Zone. We talked about it a little bit before you came on, showing a direct link with Sheldon Adelson and UC Global, Lynn Moreno, and the CIA.
That's a huge story.
And as that gains some traction, I do think that people who are kind of on the fence about Julian's situation are going to be brought over to the right side of said fence, because even the NPR liberals, who may be under the impression that Julian Assange was partially responsible for Mother not getting elected, like they dislike Sheldon Adelson much more. Like, he's a more visible target, and he's a local target, at least in terms of being a United States citizen. Uh,
I think it also
so
makes it harder for folks on the right to believe that Trump is somehow going to be Julian's saving grace as well.
Oh my, it is so mind boggling to me how there are still Trump supporters who are able to maintain their perfect, impermeable bubble of ignorance when it comes to Julian Assange.
That's because of the large amount of radio silence and general ignorance around Julian's case on the right. And this isn't to anyone specific or any specific group, but just like I watch a lot of YouTube videos and I comment in a lot of videos to get people's responses and talk about what they think and feel about certain things. And a lot of times it's the, I don't know, like the underground right wing movements that like Trump's the savior, know absolutely nothing about Julian's situation, but can tell you like to a T what happened to Michael Flynn. So there's this, I don't know, this paradox that exists within portions of the right wing internet culture, I guess, that it's, well, this guy, we're just going to not talk about him at all, where the rest of it is Daddy Trump's coming to save the day. So I think that it, in a large part, has to do with a lot of people just not even being exposed to any information about him at all.
Yeah. So on Julian's case, I guess I would say, without getting too much into the political background, because I think you did a great summary of, and also the perception out there, of both camps, the liberals and right wing folks. I was very doom and gloom when Julian was pulled out, let's face it, assaulted and yanked out of the embassy, right? I thought that it was going to be very quick, the proceedings, and their ability to get him over to the United States, and into some, dungeon in Virginia where Chelsea Manning, et cetera, has been, right? So I did not have high hopes. It is hopeful to me, in a sense, that we at least are still having this conversation, that he has not yet been extradited. However, the COVID worries are obviously awful. The treatment has been abysmal. I don't think there's been any better visceral and sort of, tangible evidence of how much they're treating him like he's like Hannibal Lecter or some serial killer or something than that whole keeping him behind glass thing they were doing a couple months ago. And I do think that kind of imagery will get folks who are on the fence, as you say, to say, hold on, something's going on here. This doesn't add up. The thing that's impressive about Julian, as always, is his ability to maintain composure and also keep his mind sharp. He will point out, and has been punished every time he's done it, how much he doesn't have the ability to talk to his lawyers, right? Or to look over the facts of the case, or, maybe they'll give him, some short period of time and he's supposed to, study hundreds of pages or something. And he's sharp enough not to play those games. He's sharp enough to still have enough recall to remember what has happened to him in any way. If that were me, right, I don't think I would have cracked by now. There's no doubt about it. And to be able to be that sharp and so on gives me hope that, he can outlast this. But how long is this going to go on? And are they just waiting for him to basically die because he gets COVID or because something else happens to him, right? We already knew his health was problematic, to put it mildly. We've known it for years. And then obviously going from the environment of being stuck home all day. By the way, I've been pointing out to everybody who is complaining about being indoors so much for the pandemic, if they've ever said anything about Julian Assange, oh, it's no big deal to be under house arrest, people can't handle a small taste of that, without going a little nutty. And can you imagine the amount of time that he spent? And now he's in a pen, can't get any video contact, obviously can't get any electronic communication out at all. I don't know what to say about it. There have already been a lot of really good actions, and I'm glad you guys have been keeping that energy up. I know you had the rally that was coordinated in Washington and London and so on a couple months ago. It's hard to keep that energy, and I hope that we're able to do that, and also do that in such a way where we can bring back in, once again, the types of groups like Anonymous and the digital freedom fighters and so on to care about Assange again. Because I do think there has been some forgetfulness about it. Just like people need to be reminded that we're still at war in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. This has gone on for a really long time, and people need to be reminded, myself included. It's just hard to keep it up, so.
Yeah, this is one of my bigger frustrations, because I do think that there's if there's any kind of distraction, then people are going to gravitate towards the distraction. And I see this in independent media so often. I personally think, and you've been on my show. Like, I make a point on my show to not hyper focus on anything. I talk about a number of different subjects, and I think that consciously or unconsciously, get content creators who only focus on one or two issues are training their audiences to tune everything else out. And when it comes to something like press freedom, when it comes to something like our ability to do this right now, and to do it on an encrypted platform, on a peer-to-peer network, to do it without, minimal Kevin interference. But it's something that affects everybody. And Fiorella Isabel was on the show last week. She's a co-host of the Convo Couch. Great show. But they kind of compartmentalize everything into Pasta takes care of civil liberties and Fiorella takes care of social justice. And she had not heard anyone say to her until last week, everything that you care about in terms of social justice reform gets thrown to the wolves if we can't have the free flow of information. And that's what the fight to save Julian Assange is 100% about. The ability to have access to an unspun, primary source document or series of documents that then we can decide for ourselves how to feel about. And that's why Action for Assange is a post-partisan movement. Because we can't even have an honest discourse about how we feel about this issue or that issue if we don't know what we're fucking talking about.
And people need to be reminded as well, as far as journalism goes, all these discussions that we've had about journalism in the last couple of years have been, atrocious in general, and besides the point at the very least. But one of the things that's not pointed out pretty much ever, except by a handful of individuals, is how much WikiLeaks changed journalism, right? The idea that some internet startup style magazine, basically like a Gizmodo or even Vice or some of these, can have a story based around a leak of a database or spreadsheets from some important person or conversations and in chat logs and so on. Looking at that direct primary information, really being a good researcher and having a story about it that tells us more about the world that we live in, how power relationships are. I'm not saying all those outlets are necessarily great at it, but the way that journalism is done is completely different now. And we'll see all these symposiums. I see them all the time, in academia about, journalism is so different than it was 2 decades. It's like, but give WikiLeaks some credit, if not a huge amount of the credit for that. And of course, it goes back to the ideology that Assange, or the ideals, I should say, that Assange helped instill in the organization. You know, information needs to be free. We want to have as much uncensored information out there as possible because we need to keep an eye on the powerful, right? To keep power in check. So yeah, that's really important.
Hey, Sean, can you stick around for a few minutes? We're going to wrap up the show, but I got a couple of questions I would like to ask you off camera, so to speak.
Sure. Yep.
All right. And I'm going to mute because it's 8 o'clock and my whole fucking town sounds off sirens and howls like goddamn idiots at 8 o'clock because, you know, they all wear masks and do what Gavin Newsom tells them to.
Yeah. I guess I'll say just one last thing here for myself. I'm working on some internet history. I have a little more time to do writing right now than usual. Slow down in some areas, speeding up in others. But so I'm trying to put together some good examples for a sort of horizontalist look at the history of the internet, at least the last 20 years. So if folks in the audience have ideas about stuff that I need to cover or I should really look at, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to contact me. I'm easy to find, Twitter, whatever. You can reach out to me. And that would be great. What I'm trying to do is not be myopic about it and only coming from my own head. So.
One thing I would like to toss in there, and then I will wrap the show up, is Susie Dawson has a great piece about the expansion of the Five Eyes surveillance state within New Zealand that has parallels into all of the other Five Eyes countries that secure the internet infrastructure of the world. So that's a big, at least to me, one of the things, like how did the surveillance systems develop in and of themselves?
Yeah, New Zealand is used as a frontier for some reason. I think it partially has to do with proximity to Asia and powerful Asian states, but also it's just the way that it's grown up. And yeah, Susie does incredible work, so I'll definitely take a look at that. Sure.
But I would like to thank you, Sean, for joining us, as well as our guests for viewing this evening. You can find me personally on Twitter at Andrew Zigman. You can find us on Twitter at action_4 Assange, as well as on Facebook, Periscope, Twitch, and a bunch of other platforms. Rockfin, we're streaming to now as well. But yeah, some final thoughts on where people can find you, Sean.
Sure. So feel free to reach out to me, privacysafe.tech. Take a look at what we're trying to do there with classes. We're going to be adding more to the schedule. I'm going to be uploading some sort of preview materials this week. We're going to be showing people how to do some cool stuff with privacy auditing their own network, which will be awesome. On Twitter, I'm at Sean O. Diggity. Also Yale Privacy Lab. And you can find me on all the alternative and federated networks as well if you're into that sort of thing, and I hope you are. So
That's great. And thanks, Sean. It was really super informative, and I'm looking forward to your classes. I will definitely be signing up for those. So I'm Kendra Christian. If you want to follow me, I'm on Twitter at edebs13. And if you want to follow Denver Free Assange, that's at DNVFreeJA. Just want to say thank you to my co-hosts, and thank you to everyone in the chat, and also to Josh and Kimber. Thank you.
My name is Steve Poikinen, and I host a show called Slow News Day. You can find it here on YouTube by typing in Slow News Day Podcast into your search bar. I am also on the Rockfin, Indeed Live, and occasionally Periscope when they're not completely hammering my thread or my live stream. Elizabeth Voss will be my guest tomorrow. So please tune in for that. That'll be 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. And either Sam Tripoli or Jared Beck, or possibly both of them at the same time, will be Sunday. So how could that not be fun? Like 3 white dudes screaming at each other in agreement for an hour and a half. Like, that's just, it's Christmas. It really is, without the family guilt. we love you guys that are watching right now. We do. You're fucking just wonderful people. I would like to remind you to please share that GoFundMe if you can. And if you can donate, that would be even better. But please do share the link and get that proliferating out there in them interwebs. Thank you, Sean. I do. I love it when you come on the show, either this one or mine. It's always a great time. Thank you to Sleepy Josh on the ones and twos and Mean Panda for the graphics. And yeah, we'll see you Saturday. Good luck to us all.